far beyond the busy cities, where the roads slowly disappeared into the endless coastline, stood an old lighthouse upon a quiet cliff. For generations, its warm light had welcomed sailors home through darkness, storms, and silent nights. It never hurried, never complained, and never stopped shining. Every evening, just before the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the lighthouse seemed to wake from its daytime rest. Golden light touched the stone walls, while gentle waves rolled endlessly below, brushing against the ancient rocks with a calm and comforting rhythm. Inside the lighthouse lived an elderly keeper named Elias. His mornings were simple, his evenings peaceful, and his nights filled with quiet purpose. He believed that every light he kindled carried hope to someone far away across the sea. As the evening breeze drifted through the open windows, Elias paused for a moment beside the great lantern. He closed his eyes and listened carefully. There was only the whisper of the ocean, the distant cry of a seabird, and the soft breath of the wind moving through the cliffs. Nothing asked for attention, nothing rushed. Everything moved with quiet patience. And perhaps, as you listen tonight, you may also begin to feel that same peaceful stillness. Morning arrived so quietly that it almost felt as if the sun had asked permission before touching the sea. A soft silver light rested gently upon the endless waves, turning the ocean into a blanket of shimmering glass. High above the water, white seabirds floated without effort, carried by the slow rhythm of the wind. There was no hurry anywhere. The world seemed content to wake one peaceful breath at a time. Inside the old lighthouse, Elias opened his eyes before the first ray of sunlight reached his room. He remained still for a few moments, listening. The waves, the wind, the distant call of a single seabird. Those sounds had greeted him every morning for nearly 40 years. He smiled quietly. There was comfort in hearing the same gentle orchestra every single day. Slowly, he folded his blanket with careful hands. Every corner was straightened. Every movement was calm. He believed that even the smallest morning ritual deserved patience. As his worn leather boots touched the old wooden floor, the lighthouse answered with its familiar creak. To many people, it might have sounded like an old building growing tired. But to Elias, it sounded like an old friend saying, "Good morning." He walked toward the tiny kitchen, where an old copper kettle rested beside a small iron stove. Filling it with fresh water, he struck a single match. A tiny flame appeared. Soon, the quiet room filled with the comforting sound of gently boiling water. He reached for a small wooden box containing dried chamomile flowers, lavender leaves, and wild herbs gathered during the previous summer. The sweet, calming fragrance slowly filled the air, blending with the cool scent of salt carried in through the open window. For Elias, every morning began with silence, a warm cup of tea, and gratitude for another peaceful day beside the sea. Elias carried the warm cup of tea upstairs, one slow step at a time. The spiral staircase curved gently around the stone walls, polished smooth by countless footsteps over the years. As he climbed, thin rays of sunlight slipped through the narrow windows, drawing golden lines across the worn wooden steps. At the very top, the great lantern room waited in complete silence. The enormous glass lens stood proudly in the center, catching every beam of morning light. Tiny drops of sea mist rested upon the crystal surface, sparkling like hundreds of tiny stars. Elias placed his tea beside the window and reached for a soft cotton cloth. With slow, careful movements, he polished the great lens. He never rushed this work. Every gentle circle of the cloth was made with quiet attention. Every small corner received the same patient care. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like an ordinary task. But for Elias, it was something much deeper. This light had guided strangers safely through storms. It had welcomed fishermen back to their families. It had helped tired sailors find home after long journeys across restless waters. As he finished cleaning the final piece of glass, sunlight poured through the lens. Thousands of tiny golden reflections danced across the wooden floor. The room glowed with warmth. Elias stood quietly, watching the light spread around him. He took one slow breath, then another. The sea below answered with its endless rhythm, wave after wave, breath after breath, moment after moment. Nothing needed to happen. Nothing needed to change. The lighthouse had stood here for generations. The sea had continued its endless song. And Elias felt grateful that, for one more peaceful morning, he could simply be a small part of that timeless harmony. He lifted his cup once again, taking one final sip of warm tea before looking toward the endless horizon, somewhere far beyond the meeting place of sea and sky. Another day had already begun, but here, everything remained calm, everything remained gentle, everything was exactly as it should be. For a little while, Elias remained standing beside the great lantern, his hands resting gently on the cool brass railing. The morning sun had climbed a little higher now, painting the endless ocean with soft ribbons of silver and gold. From this height, the world felt wonderfully simple. Tiny fishing boats drifted peacefully across the water, leaving thin white trails behind them. Far beyond the horizon, the sea blended so perfectly with the sky that it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Elias had watched this view almost every day for 40 years. Yet somehow, it never became ordinary. Every sunrise carried a different color. Every cloud told a different story. Every wave arrived with its own quiet rhythm. He slowly opened the small journal he always kept inside the lantern room. Its leather cover had faded with age. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, recording weather, tides, passing ships, and small moments that most people would never notice. Today's entry was short. The sea is calm, the wind is kind, and the morning carries peace. He smiled softly after writing the final word. There was something comforting about placing simple thoughts onto paper. It reminded him that even the quietest days were worth remembering. Just then, a gentle breeze entered through the open window. The pages of the journal fluttered slowly, one page, then another, until it stopped on an entry written many years ago. Elias looked down. Nothing needed to happen. His smile faded into thoughtful silence. It was a memory he had not visited for a very long time. The handwriting was younger, The ink had grown slightly pale, and beside those words, there was a small drawing made by a child. Elias quietly traced the little drawing with the tip of his finger, as if greeting an old friend who had been waiting patiently through the years. The morning continued to unfold with quiet grace, as though the sea itself had decided to move a little more gently than usual. Elias stood beside the great lantern room window, his warm cup of tea resting on the wooden table behind him. Before him stretched the endless Atlantic Ocean, calm and patient, reflecting the soft colors of the waking sky. He often wondered how many mornings this lighthouse had witnessed before he was born. How many sailors had looked toward this very light with hope in their hearts. How many families had waited by distant harbors, praying that the familiar beam would safely guide their loved ones home. These were questions that never needed answers. They simply drifted through his mind like clouds across the horizon. Elias slowly reached into the pocket of his old navy sweater and removed a small brass pocket watch. It no longer kept perfect time. The tiny scratches across its surface told stories of countless years spent beside the sea. He gently opened the cover. The quiet ticking still continued, not perfectly, but faithfully. He smiled. "Just like me," he whispered with a gentle laugh. Placing the watch back into his pocket, he climbed the final few steps leading to the outside balcony that circled the top of the lighthouse. The cool morning breeze welcomed him with quiet kindness. Far below, gentle waves embraced the ancient rocks before slowly returning to the sea. White seabirds glided effortlessly through the air. The world felt wonderfully unhurried. Elias rested both hands upon the old iron railing. Its surface had been polished smooth by decades of wind, closing his eyes and sunlight. He filled his lungs with the clean ocean air. He could smell salt, wild grass, fresh pine carried from the distant hills, and the faint fragrance of the herbs drying inside the lighthouse below. For one peaceful moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. No yesterday, no tomorrow, only this quiet morning. Only the sound of breathing waves. Only the steady heartbeat of the lighthouse. Elias opened his eyes once more and looked toward the endless horizon. Somewhere beyond that line, where the sky kissed the sea, another traveler might already be searching for this light. And when evening finally arrived, the lighthouse would be ready, just as it always had been, just as it always would be. The gentle breeze continued to flow around the lighthouse, carrying with it the familiar scent of salt, seagrass, and distant pine trees. Elias remained on the balcony for a long while, watching the endless movement of the ocean. Every wave seemed to arrive with a quiet purpose. Before returning peacefully to the open sea, he often believed that the ocean was speaking, not with words, but with rhythm, with silence, with patience. Many years ago, when Elias had first arrived at the lighthouse as a young man, he had expected loneliness to become his greatest challenge. He imagined long nights filled with empty silence and endless waiting. Instead, he discovered something completely different. The lighthouse was never truly silent. The wind spoke through the old wooden beams. The lantern hummed softly after sunset. The stone walls held the warmth of countless summers. And the sea never stopped telling its endless stories. Every morning it welcomed the sunrise. Every evening it carried away the fading light. Every night it reflected thousands of quiet stars. Standing there, Elias closed his eyes once again. He remembered the advice given to him by the old lighthouse keeper who had trained him many years before. If you ever begin to feel alone, listen carefully. The lighthouse always answers those who learn to be still. At first, Elias had laughed at those words. How could a building answer anyone? But after 40 years, he understood. Not through voices, not through magic, but through the comforting feeling that some places quietly become part of your heart. He rested his hand against the cool stone wall. It felt strong, steady, unchanging, like an old friend who had promised never to leave. Far below, the waves continued their endless dance against the rocks. White foam appeared for only a moment, before gently disappearing back into the sea. Nothing stayed forever, yet nothing was truly lost. Everything simply became part of the next wave. Elias smiled peacefully. Then another, allowing the quiet rhythm of the lighthouse to settle gently into his heart. The wind became softer as the morning continued, almost as though it wished not to disturb the quiet thoughts that filled Elias's mind. He remained standing beside the old stone wall, his fingers resting lightly upon its cool surface. The lighthouse had endured countless winters, fierce storms, and endless tides. Every mark upon its walls told a story that no book could ever fully capture. Elias slowly walked back inside the lantern room. Sunlight poured through the great Fresnel lens, scattering delicate patterns of light across the wooden floor. Tiny dust particles floated gently in the golden beams, dancing almost invisibly in the still air. He watched them for a moment and smiled. Even the smallest things could become beautiful when touched by light. On a nearby shelf rested a small wooden box, worn smooth by many years of careful hands. Elias opened it with quiet care. Inside were a few treasured keepsakes: a smooth white seashell, an old brass compass, a faded photograph, and a tiny carved wooden boat, no bigger than the palm of his hand. He gently picked up the little boat. Its edges had softened with time, but every detail was still there. Many years ago, during a calm summer evening, a young child from a nearby fishing village had handed it to him with a shy smile. "So you'll never feel alone," the child had said. Elias had kept that small gift ever since. Not because it was valuable, but because kindness always deserves a place to stay. He carefully returned the little boat to the box and closed the lid. Outside, the sea continued its endless conversation with the shore. The rhythm never changed. Wave after wave, breath after breath, morning after morning. Elias took one last look toward the horizon. His heart felt peaceful. The lighthouse stood quietly beside him, faithful, steady, always ready to guide another traveler home when night finally arrived. The afternoon slowly faded into evening, and the colors of the sea began to change once again. Bright blue waters softened into shades of silver, then slowly turned to deep sapphire beneath the quiet sky. Elias closed the wooden keepsake box with great care and returned it to its familiar place upon the shelf. Some memories were meant to be visited gently, never rushed, never forgotten. He walked toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the very top of the lighthouse. Each step echoed softly beneath his boots. The old tower seemed to breathe with him. When he reached the lantern room, the great Fresnel lens stood quietly before him, waiting for another night of faithful service. Elias rested both hands upon the polished brass frame. For a brief moment, he simply stood in silence. Outside, the first stars slowly appeared above the distant horizon. Fishing boats became tiny shadows upon the sea. A cool breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the familiar scent of salt and the sound of gentle waves below. It was time. With calm, practiced hands, Elias checked every brass gear, every polished mirror, and every piece of crystal glass. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything was ready. He struck a single match. A tiny golden flame flickered gently. Carefully, he touched the flame to the waiting lantern. Slowly, very slowly, the great beacon awakened. Warm golden light filled the lantern, room before shining outward across the endless ocean. The beam turned with quiet grace, sweeping across the darkening water. Far away, somewhere beyond the horizon, a sailor might look up and whisper with relief, "The lighthouse is shining." Elias never expected thanks. He never asked for recognition. His purpose had always been simple: to keep the light alive, to help strangers find their way home. He stood beside the glowing lantern, watching its steady rhythm circle across the sea. The waves answered below. The wind sang softly around the tower. Above him, countless stars filled the night sky. Elias smiled. Another peaceful evening had begun. And once again, the lonely lighthouse was no longer lonely at all. Night settled gently over the Atlantic Ocean, wrapping the world in a peaceful blanket of deep blue and silver. High above the sea, thousands of tiny stars shimmered quietly, while the lighthouse beam turned with its slow and faithful rhythm, sweeping across the dark water every few moments. Elias stood beside the lantern window, watching the beam disappear into the distance before returning again. After so many years, he still found comfort in that familiar circle of light. Every rotation felt like a promise that someone, somewhere beyond the darkness, would never lose their way. The sea was unusually calm that evening. Only gentle waves brushed against the rocks below, creating a soft rhythm that echoed through the quiet night. Elias picked up his old brass telescope and stepped onto the narrow balcony. The cool night air touched his face. He slowly looked toward the horizon. At first, there was nothing, only stars, only darkness, only the endless ocean. Then, far away, a tiny light appeared. It was so faint that it could easily have been mistaken for another star. But Elias knew the difference. Stars remained still. This light moved. Very slowly, almost silently, he lowered the telescope for a moment and smiled gently. Perhaps it was a small fishing boat returning home after a long day at sea. He imagined tired fishermen looking toward the lighthouse with quiet relief. Somewhere aboard that distant boat, someone might be thinking about a warm meal, a waiting family, or simply the comfort of reaching home before midnight. Elias raised the telescope once more. The little light continued its patient journey across the water. Without speaking, he offered a silent wish for everyone aboard. May the sea remain kind to you tonight. The lighthouse beam swept across the ocean again. For one brief moment, the distant light answered with a tiny sparkle. Elias smiled, not because he expected anyone to notice him, but because the sea always seemed to return kindness in its own quiet way. He took one last deep breath of the cool ocean air before stepping back inside the lantern room. Behind him, the lighthouse continued its endless work, steady, faithful, and full of hope for every traveler sailing through the night. The lighthouse beam continued its slow journey across the sleeping ocean, never hurrying, never missing its rhythm. Every few moments, its warm golden light returned to the tower before reaching out once more into the endless darkness. Inside the lantern room, Elias sat quietly in his old wooden chair. The night had grown deeper, and the world beyond the windows seemed wrapped in peaceful silence. He poured himself another cup of warm herbal tea. The gentle steam curled upward, disappearing into the soft glow of the lantern. Holding the cup between his hands, he looked toward a small wooden cabinet tucked beneath the staircase. He had not opened it for many years. Slowly, he walked across the room and knelt before the cabinet. The tiny brass handle felt cool beneath his fingers. With a gentle pull, the old wooden door opened. Inside rested a single weathered cedar box, wrapped in a faded blue cloth. Elias carefully lifted it onto the table. A thin layer of dust covered its lid. He smiled softly as he brushed it away. Time had touched the box, but it had never taken away the memories inside. He untied the cloth with slow, careful hands. The cedar wood released a faint, comforting fragrance, as though it had quietly preserved the past all these years. Inside the box lay a neatly folded letter, its edges worn from age. The paper had turned a warm shade of ivory. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was still clear. Elias gently unfolded the letter. For a few moments, he simply looked at it without reading. Some memories ask us to pause before we revisit them. Outside, the waves whispered against the rocks below. The lighthouse continued its faithful circle across the sea. Finally, Elias began to read. A gentle smile appeared on his face. The words were filled with kindness, with gratitude, and with hope. They reminded him that even the smallest act of care could travel farther than the brightest lighthouse beam. He folded the letter once more and held it close to his heart. The room felt warmer, not because of the lantern, but because beautiful memories have their own quiet light. Outside, the stars continued to shine above the endless Atlantic Ocean. Inside, Elias sat peacefully, listening to the sea, grateful for another quiet night in the company of his oldest friend, the lighthouse. The old letter remained in Elias's hands long after he had finished reading it. He did not hurry to place it back inside the cedar box. Some memories deserve to stay a little longer beneath the quiet light of the lighthouse. Outside, the night had become wonderfully still. The lighthouse beam continued its slow circle across the sleeping Atlantic Ocean, touching the waves with warm, golden light before disappearing once more into the darkness. Elias carefully unfolded the letter again. This time, he noticed something he had almost forgotten. Tucked inside the folded paper was a tiny, dried lavender flower. Its color had faded over the years, but a faint, comforting fragrance still remained. He closed his eyes for a moment. Almost instantly, the years melted away. He found himself remembering a peaceful summer afternoon many decades earlier. The hills surrounding the lighthouse had been covered with wildflowers. The air had carried the gentle hum of bees. Children from the nearby fishing village had laughed as they chased butterflies across the grassy cliffs. One little girl had wandered up the stone path carrying a small bundle of freshly picked lavender. She smiled shyly and held out the flowers. "For the lighthouse," she had whispered, "because its light always brings my father safely home." Elias had accepted the gift with a grateful smile. He had placed one small flower inside the letter that very evening, and somehow, after all these years, it was still there, still quietly telling its story. He gently held the fragile flower in the palm of his hand. Not everything beautiful lasts forever, but kindness has a remarkable way of living far longer than we expect. Outside, the sea continued its endless song. The stars drifted slowly across the midnight sky. The lighthouse never stopped turning. Its faithful light reached far beyond the horizon. Just as quiet acts of kindness often reach far beyond the moment they are given. Elias smiled peacefully. He carefully folded the letter once again. He placed the lavender flower back inside. Then he returned, both to the cedar box, with the same gentle care they had received for decades. Closing the lid softly, he whispered only a few quiet words. "Thank you for remembering me." The room became silent once more. Only the comforting sound of the waves, the turning lighthouse, and the peaceful rhythm of another beautiful night remained. The longest hours of the night slowly drifted away. Beyond the windows of the lantern room, the stars began to fade, one by one, giving way to the first gentle colors of dawn. The deep navy sky softened into shades of violet, then pale blue, as the horizon welcomed another peaceful morning. Elias had not slept for very long. He rarely needed to, after so many years beside the sea. His heart seemed to wake with the rhythm of the waves themselves. He stepped quietly onto the balcony. The air was cool and wonderfully fresh. Tiny drops of morning dew rested upon the iron railing, sparkling like little crystals in the first light of day. Below, the ocean breathed with its familiar rhythm. The waves rolled toward the shore, then slipped gently back again. No hurry, no struggle, only quiet patience. Elias smiled. as he watched the sunrise slowly. Paint the water with ribbons of gold and soft pink. Every dawn felt like a new beginning, not because the world had changed, but because each morning offered another chance to notice its quiet beauty. Leaving the lantern room, he walked down the winding stone staircase and stepped outside. A narrow path curved around the lighthouse, bordered by wild grasses and small clusters of blooming flowers that had grown there naturally for many years. White daisies swayed gently in the breeze. Purple lavender released its soft fragrance into the morning air. Tiny yellow wildflowers opened their petals to greet the rising sun. Elias carried a small metal watering can. Although nature cared for most of the plants on its own, he liked to offer a little help whenever the summer days became warm and dry. He poured water slowly around each flower, not too much, just enough. As he worked, a robin landed on the old wooden fence nearby. It tilted its head curiously, watching him in complete silence. Elias chuckled softly. "Good morning, my little friend," he whispered. The robin answered with a cheerful song before flying toward the cliffs. For a few quiet moments, the lighthouse, the flowers, the sea, and the little bird all seemed to share the same peaceful morning together. Elias stood upright and looked once more toward the endless Atlantic Ocean. The first fishing boats of the day had begun their gentle journey across the calm water. He lifted one hand in a quiet wave. Perhaps no one aboard could see him, but kindness, he believed, never required an audience. Sometimes, simply offering it was enough. The morning had only just begun, and the lighthouse was ready to welcome another beautiful day. After caring for the flowers around the lighthouse, Elias picked up his old walking stick and began his familiar morning walk toward the shoreline. The narrow path wound gently between soft green grasses and weathered gray rocks. Tiny wildflowers nodded in the breeze, and the fresh scent of the sea filled every breath. Above him, white gulls floated effortlessly across the brightening sky. Below, the Atlantic Ocean shimmered beneath the growing sunlight, each gentle wave carrying a silver sparkle before quietly disappearing upon the shore. Elias had walked this same path for more than 40 years, yet every morning offered something new to discover. Sometimes it was a feather resting upon the sand. Sometimes it was a shell-shaped, unlike any he had seen before. Sometimes it was simply the quiet joy of listening. The sea always had another story to tell. Reaching the beach, Elias paused beside a stretch of smooth stones polished by countless tides. He listened, wave after wave. The sound never repeated itself exactly. Each gentle ripple carried its own quiet rhythm. As he continued walking, something caught his eye. Half buried in the damp sand rested an old glass bottle. The bottle was cloudy with age, its surface softened by years beneath salt water and drifting tides. Curious, Elias knelt carefully and lifted it into the morning light. Inside, there seemed to be a tightly rolled piece of paper. He smiled with quiet surprise. The cork was still firmly in place. Who had placed the message inside? How many years had it traveled across the sea? How many sunrises? How many storms? How many silent nights? had carried it from one shore to another. Elias did not hurry to open it. Instead, he gently brushed away the sand and held the bottle in both hands. It felt cool, smooth, and wonderfully mysterious. The sea breeze whispered softly around him, almost as if encouraging patience. "There is no need to rush," Elias said quietly. "Every story arrives when it is ready." He slipped the bottle carefully into the canvas satchel hanging over his shoulder. There would be time to open it later. For now, the morning was still young. The waves continued their peaceful song. The sunlight grew warmer upon the water, and Elias resumed his slow walk along the shoreline, grateful once again for the quiet surprises that only the sea seemed to know how to give. Far behind him, the lighthouse stood tall upon the cliffs, its white stone walls shining brightly beneath the new day's sun. Watching, waiting, always ready to guide another soul safely home. The morning sun had climbed higher into the sky by the time Elias returned to the lighthouse. His canvas satchel rested comfortably against his shoulder, carrying the old glass bottle he had discovered along the shoreline. As always, he closed the heavy wooden door behind him with gentle care. The familiar scent of polished wood, sea salt, and warm stone welcomed him home. He placed the bottle upon the old oak table beside the kitchen window. Golden sunlight streamed across the glass, revealing tiny bubbles trapped inside it, small reminders of the craftsman's hands that had shaped it many years before. For a long moment, Elias simply looked at it. Not every mystery needed to be solved immediately. Some deserved a few quiet moments of appreciation before they revealed their story. He prepared another cup of herbal tea. The kettle hummed softly over the small stove. Steam curled gently into the morning light. Only when everything felt peaceful did Elias return to the table. With slow, steady hands, he wrapped a soft cloth around the neck of the bottle and carefully eased the old cork free. It came loose with the faintest whisper. A breath of cool, salty air escaped from inside, as though the bottle had been waiting many years to share its secret. Inside rested a tightly rolled piece of yellowed paper, tied with a thin blue ribbon that had faded almost to gray. Elias carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the fragile letter. The handwriting was elegant, but worn with age. At the very top, only one sentence appeared. "To the Keeper of the Light." Elias smiled. The words felt strangely personal, though he knew the letter had been written long before this morning. He continued reading. The writer spoke of a long voyage across distant seas, of difficult nights filled with heavy fog, of comfort found whenever the gentle sweep of a lighthouse appeared across the darkness. The letter ended with a simple message. If this reaches a lighthouse one day, please know that your light carried hope farther than you could ever see. Though we never met, you helped us find our way home. Thank you. Elias lowered the letter slowly. For several quiet moments, he said nothing at all. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Inside, the lighthouse felt warmer than ever. Not because the sunlight had grown brighter, but because gratitude has a way of filling even the quietest rooms. Elias folded the letter with great care and placed it beside the old cedar box. Then, He looked toward the sea with a peaceful smile. He had spent a lifetime tending the light, never expecting applause, never asking for recognition. Yet somehow, across the years, across the tides, his quiet work had reached hearts he would never know. And that, he thought, was more than enough. The afternoon slowly melted into evening, and the lighthouse stood quietly beneath a sky painted with gentle shades of gold, amber, and soft rose. Elias stepped outside, carrying only his walking stick and a light wool jacket over his shoulders. He had a simple habit. Every evening, before lighting the beacon, he walked once around the lighthouse. Not because he needed to, but because it reminded him to notice the beauty that surrounded him. The narrow path curved gently along the cliffs. Wild grasses danced with the breeze. Tiny white daisies closed their petals as the sunlight grew softer. The lavender flowers released their sweet fragrance into the cool evening air. Elias paused beside a weathered wooden bench that overlooked the ocean. He sat down slowly. From there, he could see almost everything. The endless Atlantic, the distant fishing boats returning home, the lighthouse rising proudly behind him, and the first seabirds flying back toward their nests. He listened carefully. The world seemed wonderfully unhurried. The waves rolled in, then slipped away again. A gentle breeze whispered through the tall grass. Somewhere far below, water touched the rocks with a soft, familiar rhythm. Nothing asked to be different. Nothing hurried toward tomorrow. Everything simply existed, exactly as it was. Elias took a slow breath and smiled. He thought about the many evenings he had spent on this very bench. Stormy evenings, sunny evenings, foggy evenings, evenings filled with silence. Each one had been different, yet each had offered the same quiet gift: peace. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, its golden reflection stretched across the ocean like a glowing pathway. Elias often imagined that every traveler at sea could follow that path home, not only with their eyes, but with hope. A small family of rabbits appeared near the edge of the grass. They paused for a moment, their ears twitching gently before disappearing into the wildflowers. Elias chuckled softly. Even after 40 years, the lighthouse still found little ways to surprise him. The air grew cooler. High above, the first evening star appeared. Elias rose from the bench, brushed a little dust from his coat, and turned toward the lighthouse. Soon it would be time to light the great beacon once again. Another night was waiting, another journey across the sea. And as always, the faithful lighthouse would be ready. With slow, steady footsteps, Elias began walking home. Behind him, the setting sun slipped quietly below the horizon. Ahead of him, the warm stone tower waited patiently, just as it always had. A place of light, a place of comfort, a place that, somehow, had become his heart. Twilight settled gently over the coastline. The last colors of sunset slowly faded, leaving behind a sky filled with soft shades of lavender and deep blue. One by one, the first stars began to appear, shining quietly above the endless Atlantic Ocean. Elias climbed the familiar spiral staircase with calm, steady footsteps. Every evening followed the same gentle rhythm. Yet somehow, it always felt new. When he reached the lantern room, the great Fresnel lens waited silently in the center of the tower. The polished crystal reflected the fading light of the evening, filling the room with soft golden colors. Elias smiled. "Good evening, old friend," he whispered to the lighthouse. He gently checked each brass gear, every polished mirror, every glass panel. Everything was exactly as it should be. Outside, fishing boats were beginning their journey home. Tiny lanterns flickered across the distant water, like little stars floating upon the sea. Elias lit the beacon with careful hands. The warm golden light slowly grew brighter. For a brief moment, the lantern room glowed like the heart of the lighthouse itself. Then, the great beam began its endless journey once more, across the cliffs, across the calm Atlantic Ocean, across the quiet night. Far beyond the horizon, a young sailor stood on the deck of a small fishing boat. It was his first season at sea. The ocean still felt vast and unfamiliar. As darkness gathered around the boat, he searched the horizon with hopeful eyes. Then he saw it, a single warm beam of light sweeping across the water. The young sailor smiled with relief. He didn't know the keeper's name. He didn't know the stories hidden inside the old lighthouse. But he trusted the light completely. Back inside the tower, Elias watched the beam turn slowly through the night. He imagined countless travelers seeing the same light, each carrying their own hopes, their own dreams, their own journey home. The lighthouse never asked where they came from. It simply welcomed them, just as it always had. The wind whispered softly around the tower. The sea answered with its endless rhythm, and under the quiet blanket of stars, the faithful lighthouse continued shining, steady, warm, and kind. For Elias, that simple light had become more than a duty. It had become a promise that no matter how dark the night became, hope would always be waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. The lighthouse beam swept slowly across the quiet sea, painting a path of warm light over the gentle waves. Far beyond the cliffs, the young sailor kept his eyes fixed on that familiar glow. The sea was calm, the wind was gentle, and the small fishing boat moved steadily toward home. Around him, the older fishermen worked with quiet confidence. They had traveled these waters for many years, speaking only when necessary, allowing the peaceful rhythm of the ocean to guide their hands. The young sailor stood beside the railing and looked toward the lighthouse once again. Its light appeared, then disappeared, only to return a few moments later. Each time it came back, he felt a little more certain that home was not far away. Back at the lighthouse, Elias placed another piece of wood into the small stone fireplace below the lantern room. A soft crackle filled the cozy space. He warmed his hands beside the fire before opening the window, just enough to hear the sea. The familiar sound drifted inside like an old friend. He closed his eyes. The waves, the wind, the turning beacon. Together, they formed a gentle melody that had been part of his life for decades. He remembered something the old keeper had once told him. The brightest light is often the quietest one. At the time, Elias had not fully understood those words. Now, after so many years, they felt wonderfully true. The lighthouse never shouted. It never demanded attention. It simply shone with quiet faithfulness, night after night. Perhaps kindness was much the same. It did not need applause. It did not need to be noticed. It simply needed to be offered. Outside, a family of dolphins surfaced briefly in the moonlit water before slipping gracefully. Beneath the waves, again, the young sailor noticed them and smiled. For a moment, the worries of the long day faded away. Only the peaceful sea remained. Only the guiding light. Only the promise of home. Inside the lighthouse, Elias opened the window a little wider and breathed in the cool night air. The stars sparkled above him. The Atlantic stretched endlessly into the darkness. And somewhere beyond the horizon, he knew that another traveler was following the light. That thought brought him quiet happiness. He whispered softly into the night, "May every journey end safely." The wind carried his words away across the sea. Whether anyone heard them did not matter. Sometimes the kindest wishes were the ones spoken only to the waves. The lighthouse continued its faithful circle, shining without pause, as it had for generations. And in that peaceful rhythm, the night felt gentle, safe, and full of quiet hope. The night had grown deep and wonderfully quiet. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the stars, its gentle waves reflecting ribbons of silver moonlight. The lighthouse beam continued its patient journey across the water, turning with the same steady rhythm it had followed for generations. Elias stood once again on the balcony at the very top of the tower. The cool night breeze brushed softly against his face, carrying the familiar scent of salt and distant pine forests. Somewhere below, the waves whispered against the ancient rocks, a sound he had listened to for most of his life. He rested his hands on the weathered iron railing and looked toward the horizon. There was something comforting about the darkness. It did not feel empty. It felt peaceful. Above him, countless stars filled the sky. Some were bright, some were faint, yet together they created a quiet beauty that no single star could create alone. Elias thought about the many years he had spent caring for the lighthouse. The seasons had changed. Storms had come and gone. Ships had arrived and departed. Faces had appeared for a short while before becoming gentle memories carried by time. Yet the lighthouse had remained faithful, patient, always ready to welcome another night. He smiled as he remembered the little gifts life had given him. The child's wooden boat, the dried lavender flower, the old letter carried by the sea, the messages inside the leather journal. None of them had been planned. Each had arrived quietly, like the tide itself. They had taught him something simple. A meaningful life is often built from small moments that many people never notice. A kind word, a warm cup of tea, a peaceful sunrise, the sound of waves against the shore. These quiet treasures had become the richest part of his life. A shooting star crossed the sky for only a brief second. Elias watched it disappear beyond the horizon. He did not make a wish. Instead, he whispered, Thank you. Thank you for another peaceful day. Thank you for another safe night. Thank you for the sea, for the lighthouse, and for every traveler who had trusted its light. The wind answered with a gentle sigh. The waves continued their endless song below. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, listening carefully. Everything felt exactly as it should. When he opened them again, the first faint hint of dawn was beginning to touch the far eastern horizon. Night was slowly preparing to hand the world back to the morning. The lighthouse beam still turned faithfully through the fading darkness, shining until the sun no longer needed its help. Elias smiled one last time before quietly stepping back inside the lantern room. Another beautiful night was almost complete, and another peaceful morning was gently on its way. A gentle glow slowly appeared along the eastern horizon. The stars faded one by one, and the deep blue sky softened into pale shades of lavender, peach, and gold. Morning arrived quietly, just as it always had. From the lantern room, Elias watched the first rays of sunlight touch the calm Atlantic Ocean. The lighthouse beam continued to turn for a few final moments. Then, as daylight grew brighter, its work for the night was complete. With calm and practiced hands, Elias gently slowed the great mechanism. The powerful beam became softer, then faded into silence. The giant Fresnel lens still sparkled beautifully in the morning sun, but now it reflected daylight instead of creating its own. Elias rested his hand on the polished brass frame. "Well done," he whispered with a peaceful smile. Outside, seabirds welcomed the new day with cheerful calls. The ocean shimmered like liquid gold beneath the rising sun. Fishing boats that had followed the lighthouse through the night were now safely making their way into the harbor. From the high windows, Elias watched tiny figures waving from the decks. Perhaps they were greeting one another. Perhaps they were simply celebrating another safe journey home. Either way, it made him smile. He carefully cleaned the lantern glass, just as he had done every morning for decades. Not because anyone would inspect it, not because anyone had asked, but because caring for something day after day was its own quiet reward. When the work was finished, he opened every window in the lantern room. Fresh ocean air flowed through the tower, carrying the scent of salt, wildflowers, and damp earth after the cool night. The lighthouse seemed to breathe with him. Below, the village slowly awakened. Thin trails of smoke rose from cottage chimneys. Children's laughter drifted faintly on the breeze. A fishing bell echoed from the harbor. Life was beginning again. Elias poured the last of his warm tea into a small ceramic cup and stood by the window. He raised it gently toward the sea. "To another beautiful day," he said softly. He took one slow sip. The tea was warm. The morning was calm. The world felt exactly as it should. And for Elias, there was no greater happiness than watching the sun rise over the ocean while knowing the lighthouse had once again fulfilled its quiet promise. The day stretched ahead with simple tasks, gentle moments, and peaceful silence. And he welcomed every one of them with a grateful heart. The morning passed gently, just as so many mornings had before. Sunlight filled every corner of the lighthouse, warming the old stone walls and the polished wooden floors. The salty breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the quiet sounds of the sea inside. Elias spent the morning as he always did. He polished the brass railings until they shone like gold. He dusted the old shelves where decades of memories rested peacefully. He watered the lavender growing beside the lighthouse door. Every task was small. Every movement was unhurried. Yet together, they created a life filled with quiet purpose. As the afternoon light softened, Elias climbed once more to the balcony at the top of the lighthouse. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly before him. He had watched this view through every season of his life. He had seen calm seas and fierce storms, brilliant sunrises and silent nights, ships arriving, ships departing, children growing into adults, and old friends becoming cherished memories. The sea had taught him something few people ever truly learned. Nothing stayed the same forever. The tides changed. The wind changed. The seasons changed. Even people changed. But kindness could remain. A single act of kindness could travel farther than the strongest wave. It could live in someone's memory for years, perhaps even for generations. Elias looked down at the village below. Smoke curled gently from the chimneys. Children laughed as they chased one another along the narrow paths. Fishing boats rested safely in the harbor after another successful journey. He smiled. The lighthouse had never belonged only to him. It belonged to everyone who looked toward it with hope, everyone who found comfort in its light, everyone who returned home because it faithfully stood watch through the night. A gentle breeze lifted the edge of his navy sweater. He closed his eyes. The warm sunlight touched his face. The sound of the waves rose softly from below. For one peaceful moment, there was nothing to remember, nothing to worry about, nothing to chase. Only this moment, only this quiet breath, only the simple joy of being exactly where he was. When Elias opened his eyes again, a single white seagull glided past the lighthouse, disappearing into the endless blue sky. He watched until it became only a tiny white dot in the distance. Then he whispered with a peaceful smile, "Every journey begins with hope, and every home is brighter because someone keeps the light burning." The lighthouse stood quietly behind him, faithful, patient, ready for another evening, and ready for one final story. The sun slowly drifted toward the western horizon, painting the sky with gentle shades of amber, rose, and soft gold. Another peaceful day was coming to its quiet end. Elias stood outside the lighthouse for a few silent moments, watching the evening light dance across the calm Atlantic Ocean. The sea looked almost like polished glass. Every gentle wave reflected the colors of the sky. Every breath of wind carried the familiar scent of salt and wildflowers. He smiled, not because anything extraordinary had happened that day, but because ordinary days had become the greatest gift of all. He walked slowly around the lighthouse one final time. His hand rested gently against the old stone walls. The lighthouse had sheltered him through countless seasons, through storms, through bright summer mornings, through quiet winter nights. It had become more than a place to live. It had become home. Inside the lantern room, the great Fresnel lens waited patiently. Its crystal surface glowed softly in the evening light. Elias polished the glass one last time before lighting the evening beacon. Every careful movement carried years of love and devotion. When everything was ready, he lit the great lamp. The familiar golden beam awakened and slowly began its graceful journey across the sea. Once again, the light reached toward distant boats, toward unknown travelers, toward anyone searching for a safe way home. Elias stood quietly beside the glowing lantern. He did not think about the years that had passed. He did not wonder about tomorrow. Instead, he simply listened. The turning beacon, the whispering waves, the gentle evening wind. Together, they created the same peaceful melody that had welcomed him every day for so many years. Outside, the first stars appeared above the Atlantic. A fishing boat crossed the horizon. Its tiny lantern answered the lighthouse with a warm flicker. Elias smiled softly. Somewhere out there, another family would soon welcome someone home. And perhaps, without ever knowing his name, they would quietly thank the faithful light that had guided the way. He closed his eyes for one long, peaceful breath. When he opened them again, the lighthouse beam swept across the ocean once more. Steady, gentle, unchanging, just like hope, just like kindness, just like love shared without asking for anything in return. As the night embraced the sea, Elias settled into his old wooden chair beside the lantern room window. He wrapped a warm blanket around his shoulders and watched the waves shimmer beneath the moonlight. The lighthouse continued its endless circle. The ocean continued its endless song. And the world, for one quiet night, felt completely at peace. Perhaps every heart carries its own little lighthouse. A quiet light that never gives up. A gentle hope that always waits. A kindness that keeps shining, even in the darkest night. And as the waves whispered softly against the ancient cliffs, as the stars watched over the sleeping sea, and as the faithful lighthouse continued to glow, the story slowly came to rest. Like the tide returning home, like the wind settling after a long journey, like a peaceful heart finally ready to dream. Good night, and may your own light always guide you gently home.